I don't know if this is recording. The battery light is red. It's always red now, ever since I brought it near the opening. I found one of the threads outside the cave, I mean. It had come loose from the rock face, and it was just laying across the path like a tripwire. Silver, thinner than hair. And I touched it because I didn't know. I didn't know yet what they were. It vibrated when I touched it, the way a guitar string vibrates. And I heard my mother's voice. My mother has been dead for 11 years. She said my name, just my name, the way she used to say it when I was small and it was dark and I was frightened. I think the forest has been practicing. There are 142 active case files in the Redacted Archives. I have personally reviewed 111 of them. I am retired now, in the technical sense of the word. I sit in a chair that is too soft for my back, and I drink tea that has gone cold before I remember to drink it. And sometimes, on the long evenings when the radiator ticks and the window shows me nothing but my own reflection, I open the files again. Not all of them deserve to be opened again. Case file 080 is one I have opened 17 times. Each time I tell myself it will be the last. The subject's name has been redacted per standard protocol. I will call her Marin. That is not her name, but it is close enough to the shape of her, close enough to the way she moved through the world before she found the room inside the limestone, before she learned what the forest does with what it takes. Marin was 63 years old at the time of her initial discovery, a retired seamstress. She had lived her entire life in a hollow in the southern Appalachians, a place the local maps labeled with a name I am not permitted to repeat, in a county that has produced a disproportionate number of missing persons reports over the last 140 years. The archives are aware of the county. The archives have always been aware of the county. Our inaction is a matter I have raised formally on 4 separate occasions, and I will not raise again, because I am retired now, in the technical sense of the word. Marin's late husband had been a geologist, amateur but thorough. When he died, 8 years before the events of this file, he left her a house full of survey maps, limestone samples, and handwritten notebooks detailing the cave systems beneath the hollow. Marin had never read them while he was alive. She found them useful after, when the loneliness of the hollow became the kind of quiet that needed filling. She began exploring the shallower cave mouths that autumn. This is documented in her own diary, which was recovered and has been partially archived. Her handwriting was precise and small, the handwriting of a woman who had spent decades measuring thread by fractions of an inch. She first found the weaving room on a Tuesday in October. October had come in cold that year, the way it sometimes does in the mountains. Not gradually, but all at once, as if the season had simply decided. The maples had gone to red, and the sourwood had gone to purple, and the mornings tasted of wood smoke from neighbors she could not see through the tree line. Maren walked the same limestone ridge she had walked a dozen times before. Her husband's survey maps were folded in her vest pocket. She carried a headlamp on an elastic band, and a canvas bag with a thermos, and a small geological hammer that she did not know how to use correctly, but carried because he had always carried one. The ridge dropped off sharply about a quarter mile from the house. She had noted the drop before, had noted the crack in the rock face, long and vertical, like something had pressed a thumb into the stone and dragged it downward. She had not gone through the crack before because it was narrow, and the dark inside it was a particular quality of dark she did not have a word for. That Tuesday, something was different. There was a smell coming from the crack. Not unpleasant. That is important, and the case file notes it specifically. The smell was not unpleasant. It was damp limestone, and something beneath the limestone, something that reminded Maren, in her own diary, of the inside of a cedar chest, of old fabric, of a room that has been closed for a very long time and still holds the shape of what it once stored. She turned sideways and pressed through the crack. The passage beyond was tighter than it appeared and longer than she expected. She moved with her back to one wall and her hands flat against the other, feeling the cool sweat of the stone against her palms, and the headlamp threw a pale oval of light ahead of her that showed her only more passage, more gray, more dark. She told herself she would go back. She told herself this at 3 separate points in the passage. At each point, she did not go back. The passage opened. She came into the room without warning. One step, she was in the narrow dark, and the next, she was standing in a chamber that her headlamp could not fully illuminate. She could sense the ceiling more than see it, felt the way the darkness piled upward. The floor was flat limestone, worn smooth by water that had not moved through it in centuries. And there were the threads. She wrote about him for 3 full pages in her diary before she allowed herself to describe anything else. This is how I know the description is accurate. It was the thing her mind went to first and stayed with longest. They ran from the far wall of the chamber, from cracks in the limestone so fine she could not see them without pressing her face close. And they crossed the chamber in long, nearly horizontal lines, vanishing into a second passage on the opposite side. Dozens of them, perhaps more than dozens. They were silver, or they appeared silver in the headlamp's light, though she would later write that silver was not quite the right word. Silver is a cold color, she wrote. These were not cold. They caught the light the way certain old threads catch afternoon light through a window, with a warmth inside them, as though the light were passing through something living rather than reflecting from something metal. They were thin, thinner than silk, thinner than spider silk. She brought her face close to one, and she could barely see it, could only confirm it was real by pressing her finger to it, softly, the way you press a finger to a surface to test for dust. It vibrated, a single note, low and resonant, the kind of frequency that lives in the chest rather than the ear. She pulled her hand back. The thread continued to vibrate for longer than it should have. She counted without meaning to. Her mind defaulted to counting the way it had always defaulted, from decades of counting stitches, counting lengths, counting the intervals between things. The thread vibrated for 11 seconds after she had ceased to touch it. She did not touch another thread that day. She went home, and she made herself dinner, and she sat in her husband's chair by the wood stove, and she thought about what she had heard. Not music, not quite, but arranged. That was the word she used in her diary. The sound was arranged, as though someone had placed it there deliberately, had tuned it to a specific note for a specific purpose. She went back the next morning. Over the following 2 weeks, Maren returned to the weaving room every day. She brought a headlamp with better batteries, and then a second headlamp, and then a small battery-powered lantern that gave her a wider field of light and let her see the chamber more completely. It was larger than her first impression had allowed, perhaps 40 feet across, irregular at the edges, with the threads crossing it at varying heights, some near the floor, some at waist height, some high enough that she had to tilt her head back to see where they vanished into the ceiling cracks. She began to understand, slowly, that the chamber was not a natural formation altered by the threads. The threads were the point of the chamber. The chamber existed to hold them. She found eventually that the threads were not identical. Each one vibrated at a different frequency. Each one, when touched, produced a different note. This is where Maren's experience as a seamstress became significant. And, I believe, this is why the forest chose her for what came next. If choosing is a concept that applies to what the forest does. She had an ear for thread, for tension, for the relationship between thickness and vibration and length. She began to map the threads by frequency, by feel, by the length of their sustained note after contact. She filled a notebook with these observations. She used a system of notation she invented herself, part musical notation, part the shorthand of her trade. She did not yet understand that she was reading names. It was on the 17th day that she touched the thread she recognized. She had been working her way methodically from the left wall of the chamber toward the center, touching each thread in sequence and marking her notation. The lantern was bright and steady. The cave smelled of cedar and limestone and the deep, untouched cold of underground. She was calm. She had achieved, over these 17 days, a researcher's calm, the kind that comes not from the absence of strangeness, but from familiarity with it. She touched the thread. It vibrated for exactly 11 seconds, as they all did. And in those 11 seconds, she heard her daughter's voice. Her daughter, Carrie, who had gone missing 4 years prior, who had walked into the woods one January morning to collect firewood and had not come back, whose case was still technically open with the county sheriff, whose photograph was still on the refrigerator, held by a magnet shaped like a pineapple. Carrie's voice, saying a word Maren could not quite resolve, something that bent the air the way a word bends air when it is spoken in another room, through a wall, and you catch the shape, but not the content. Maren let go of the thread. She sat down on the floor of the cave. She sat there for a very long time. The notation in her diary from that day covers 2 pages and is largely illegible. The only time in all the recovered notebooks that her precise, small handwriting loses its shape. What can be read suggests that she understood, in the sitting, what the threads were, what they carried, that the silver was not fiber, and was not wire, and was not anything that had been manufactured, that it had grown from the forest the way mycelium grows, except inward, into the limestone, into the chamber, across the room, and out again through the second passage, into the deeper dark of the earth, and that the voices inside the threads were not echoes, they were current. Carrie was not dead in the way Maren had feared. The forest had not destroyed her daughter. It had taken her apart, had found the frequency of her, had found the specific vibration that a human voice makes when it is shaped by a particular body, a particular set of bones and cartilage and muscle memory. And it had drawn that frequency out, had stretched it, had woven it into something that could be stored. The forest was a loom. This is the language the case file uses. The forest was a loom, and the people it took were thread. Maren touched the thread again. This time she held it. The case file documents what happened to Marin's hands over the following weeks. I will not read those details aloud. I will say only that the changes were consistent with the other recovered subjects, the two others in the history of the archives who had made contact with a loom site and sustained prolonged exposure. The skin of her fingertips became translucent, not metaphorically, not as a symptom of illness, literally translucent, thin enough eventually that you could see through her fingertips to the light behind them. She lost her voice on the 41st day, not to illness, not to silence, to pitch. Her voice from that point forward carried a harmonic inside it that had not been there before, a secondary frequency, a resonance that was not hers. Carrie's frequency. What Marin had done, what she could not stop herself from doing once she understood, was weave herself. She had pressed her living frequency against her daughter's thread until the two had begun to merge. She had made herself both seamstress and thread. The forest had let her. The forest, I think, had been waiting for someone to do exactly that. Whether she succeeded, whether the merging of frequencies restored anything that had been taken, or whether it simply added one more thread to the loom, is a question the archives cannot answer. Marin's house was found empty in the spring. The notebooks were on the kitchen table, weighted with a limestone sample from her husband's collection. The survey maps were gone. The crack in the ridge face has since been sealed by the county, ostensibly for safety reasons. There are 3 other cave mouths in the hollow that her husband's notebooks identify as connected to the same system. They have not been sealed. The archives are aware of this. There are currently 47 missing persons reports associated with that county going back to 1883. 47 names. I have read each of them. I think sometimes about whether each one has a thread, whether the loom is patient enough, and I believe it is. I believe patience is the only thing the forest has in abundance. To have kept all 47, to have tuned 47 lengths of silver to 47 particular frequencies, stored in a chamber in the limestone beneath the hollow. I think about Marin's daughter, Carrie. I think about a cold January morning and a woman walking into the trees for firewood. I think about what the forest heard in her voice, what it recognized, what it decided to keep. I am closing case file 080 now for the 17th time. The file closes the way it always closes, not with an answer, but with the understanding that some questions are themselves a kind of thread. that to pull at them is to become part of the weaving. The hollow is quiet tonight. Everything in it is exactly where the forest wants it to be.